Remy, Jason, it's a
Yes,
kind of
please.
encyclopedia, isn't it?
I didn't, I beg your pardon, I didn't quite catch you.
It's a kind of encyclopedia.
Actually, it's all related to the purpose of building up a curriculum for youngsters. So just last week, I had a chat with Peter Tottenham and Delia McNamara, who is the current president of ISSS. And we have George here. George is the elect president, next one. So there is a project proposed by myself years ago, but got vetoed by them. The project was to build a set of curriculum starting from K-12 students, and the second one to the young students in college, and then perhaps graduate college. So it needs to be consistent, comprehensive for three different levels. And if we could build up such a curriculum, and we can have, more youngsters can have a chance to get exposed to system science and cybernetics. That's the idea. So that's also part of the incentive that we need to discuss this type of contents. I'm done. So the floor is yours, everybody.
Jason, this is Richard Knowles. I spoke last week.
Yes.
For years, I've been trying to do kind of what you did, is bring this technology to the place where regular people can talk about it and learn from it. I mentioned John Bennett's work last week, and he talks like you did of different levels of 1, 2, 3, 4. In his books on the dramatic universe, volumes 2 and 3, he talks about those kind of ideas, which might be useful. But what I find was, in working with groups of people who really don't care at all about all these names that we throw around, we begin with a problem. What's your problem? And then begin, and it's a problem that's important to them. So there's already energy invested by them in trying to figure out this thing, which they've got. And beginning with the problem, then begin to introduce these ideas as ways to look at them that are different from what they've done before. And I find people grab that pretty quickly, as long as we don't throw the jargon around, and we don't have to. A lot of these basic principles are relatively simple in my view, maybe not, but they can get very complex, but we can talk about them, and people, when they see them working on their own problems and seeing how the problems begin to come up and show themselves differently and begin to see possible solutions and paths forwards, they just jump right in and use these things. And, like the process enneagram I introduced, people use that. And they're often astonished about how easy it is. And my stepdaughter used the process enneagram in her youth group at church. She was in charge of the youth group. They said it was the best year they'd ever had using the complexity tool. So to bridge the gap between the technology and the science and the practical application. And I kind of begin with the problem, and that's what gets people interested. They're not interested in learning something new just to learn something new. They'd rather go play with their computer games and whatnot. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. Actually, problem solving is the second important incentive. Even come before the curiosity, right?
Well, they got a problem and they're struggling with it. They don't know what the answer is. And if it's one that's really serious to them, they're willing to say, well, let's look at this a little bit more, and we can do it. And I've done these workshops that I talked about last week with people who can't read or write. And it's okay, they get it, because I think we're dealing with the natural processes here.
Mm.
What I found interesting in researching the American Revolution was the power of perception when you start taking away your cultural filters. And if you look back at what Francis Bacon did in his Novum Orgum, he says there's the naked brain that leaves the world in disarray and tatters. What we require is a method to test our perceptions, our conceptions, and actions. And cybernetics really goes to that last part of actions, testing the consequence of actions, which is not a thing, but as you said, Jason, in your presentation, it is a relationship and interaction. So it's a contextual aspect, not a content element aspect. And that's where, you know, the fact that Americans were using inoculations of the cowpox to cure their smallpox epidemic. And they didn't understand the processes, but they could see how a cow maid would never get smallpox. You know, they could observe. So it's not just cognition like most of our educational institutions prioritize, it's the ability to perceptualize.
I just posted something in the chat. It's a reference to a journal article that I did several years back, coming from teaching many classes at all levels at the university, freshmen, and I mean freshmen who had very little science knowledge at all. And they took this course because it was going to get them science credits. And basically what it was is I posed in the context of the course, I posed a problem that was, suppose you've got an option on some land near Seattle, and you want to construct a permaculture living system for say 50 people, as the number is arbitrary. But how much land do you actually need to feed? And they're all vegan, so we're just talking about vegetables. So starting from that problem statement, we went through a whole series of talking about where does your food come from. I did an exercise where we talked about your refrigerator as a system with inputs and outputs and so on. So we're getting everything kind of set up and then posing this problem. So in groups of 3, small team, they tackled, well, how would I answer that question? How would I go about answering that question? Now, I was gently sort of guiding them through the process, working backwards from the caloric output of this permaculture back to the solar insulation that's coming in, and what is the aperture that you need to collect enough sunlight here so that you end up with enough calories here. And so most of them didn't know how to use a spreadsheet except for collecting notes or something. By the end of that time, they had, and it was a large number of them. I have very, very few people who just didn't get it. But what they ended up doing was building a spreadsheet model, starting with insulation over here and ending up with calories of edible food over here through many, many steps. And I've had a number of students over the years who have gotten back in touch with me and said, and told me essentially, boy, the way that thinking goes has made a real change in my life. And several of them gave me examples. I had one young lady, she was a clerk in a store. Within about half a year, she was the assistant manager, the clothing store. She was assistant manager because she went in and figured out some problems in inventory that she just applied that systems thinking to. So that was kind of rewarding for me to to know that that was actually doing something for people. Oh,
We
and
have- we
just
have a new-
recently, the OECD committee on I forget what it is, but they put out a report citing that work for ways of how do we get students interested, and how do we get difficult technical knowledge transferred to them when they have very little background.
We have a new friend here. We have a new friends here. Lucille, you are the first time joining our club. Would you like to say something and let everybody know you? You need to unmute your mic. You're still muted.
Yeah. No. Now it's supposed to be working, right? Do you hear me?
Yes, now we hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, thank you for inviting me in this meeting. So I'm working since a long time into these issues of second order. Lute and Bernard know me since how many years? Maybe 20, 25, something like that. And so I'm enjoying this meeting, what you are talking about. I mean, my, let's say, institutional field of work is about economics and more specifically industrial networks, let's say, this type of issues. I mean, this is as a synthetic presentation, I think, is enough.
Thank you. Welcome. And the Klaus,
Yep.
we missed you a long time.
Yeah. Well, I was very busy with other things, and so I'm glad I'm here.
Would you like to address our group as a professor?
I would like to just say one thing, that I think Jason's third point, third dimension, is to be very important. Then the practical application. I think most of the other kind of conceptions are understanding, if you want, very centered on the understander, the investigator, but have no significant consequences. And I wanted to ask, actually, what are principles? Whose principles, and what do they do? And so I think, to me, the more important part is just what can be done. And now I think in the history of cybernetics, it's not all that very social initially, but it was all centered around doing things. That means building machines that are somehow better or whatever. So I think the dimensions of doing is to be very important.
Yeah, I fully agree. Without doing science, we retreat back to philosophy. With engineering, we have the utility. We have the utilitarian values, and our lives improve. So, Jamie, want to say something? Alex, Jamie. Yeah.
Alex, you go first. The younger generation first.
Okay.
I had niche. I added myself. So Jamie, you go. Thank you.
But I have a list. Maybe a question for all three. That is that none of you mentioned any role for metaphors. Now, I do know from Bernard and your mentor, Gordon Tusk, that there is a role for metaphors. So I'm just curious why none of you mentioned it. And yeah, I'll start with that question. And so let me turn it around in a positive way. So do you have to say anything about would you think it might make your presentations richer and more interesting and relevant if you were to add something about metaphors, or do you think that this is just a minor detail?
May I speak?
Yes, of course. But I do make I had a metaphor of the mountain full of treasures and we are digging there.
Well,
That's a metaphor, right?
I was going to quote the past definition. The cybernetics is the art and science of manipulating defensible metaphors.
Yes.
That itself is full of metaphors. But if you unlock that, it means that, well, you have to acknowledge that metaphors are basically analogies, shorthand for an analogy mapping two domains, and that if you're going to manipulate them in justifiable ways, then basically you're doing science. So I mean, that's one interpretation of that. But I'm also accepting as Pastor that you know, much of our thinking, if all of our thinking has metaphor in there somewhere, right from the ground up. I mean, the ancient word from Old German or whatever for world, according to Spencer Brown, means the old man. So you know, the language is rich in metaphor, and we use it all the time. The word language itself is, where does that come from? To do with tongue, the tongue. But we use the word to cover. Oh, yeah. I mean, fascinating topic.
I should have restated my question, maybe a little more fine-grained. Does that you have not commented of the state of the art of understanding how metaphors work and are present in society. So what I heard from your presentations is that as if there is everyone in the world, the 7.6 billion people, kind of understand how metaphors work, and there's no confusion whatsoever that there will be a couple of people who are actually having the wrong relation with metaphors or just the wrong understanding of metaphors work. So to pay any attention to the theories of metaphors and how they're taught, it's like a total trivial problem that we don't really need to talk about because it has nothing to do with how cybernetics is understood. So it's more a question about the state of the art of how our educational institutions are just working with the students and the teachers and the administrators and whatever the principals on just how they work with metaphors. And just the question is for all three of you, and George Mobus, maybe since this is the first time we interact like this, I'm particularly interested.
Mary Hesse, do you know Mary Hesse?
Mary Hesse, yes.
That's the important philosopher of metaphors.
Yeah, but I'm interested in George because and Jason I already know, but George, I don't know.
Okay, so in the book that I just presented, I don't think there's anything in there about metaphors. We were just trying to get at, you know, what the nature of system science, what comprises it, and so forth. I'm working on a newer book. Well, I have a book out about sapiens, and I go into the construction of mental models, how that comes about. And then in the new book, I extend that out to social, how societies come up with new, you know, new not artifacts, but
models, yeah.
Yeah, essentially. And metaphor plays a role in that. But that's to be published yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to jump in quickly. I just threw something into the chat here. The book Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson is, in my experience, like the landmark text for using metaphors themselves as an epistemology to approaching different kinds of science.
It's biologistic.
Yeah.
It's biologistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you haven't been familiar with this text, Metaphors We Live By is an absolutely critical text. It's brilliant.
Yes, and I actually I left my question open-minded because I wanted to hear about backgrounds of people that I wasn't aware of. So there is actually another book by Stephen Pepper, and some of you are familiar with it, World Hypothesis, and that was published in 1942. And he actually says, this while Lakoff and Johnson did an enormous, valuable job of popularizing the idea of metaphors, they also did a very horrible job because they did they gave the worst gift to mankind because they pushed the machine metaphor, and so they kind of messed up their own theory of metaphors because they never discussed the limitations of the machine metaphor. They actually, if you read them carefully, they all go like everyone needs to adopt the computational theory of the mind, and there's no other metaphor to think about. And the value of Stephen Pepper's book, and I have heard it discussed among cyberneticians, and one of them is Michael Jackson, and I remember his name because he's Michael Jackson, but someone else did it recently. Does that there are also structural metaphors, like just the hierarchy, that's a yardstick or the container. And working with structural metaphors doesn't require you to think of yourself as a machine. But so I'm curious, Mari Hessen is another one, but maybe Lucio, and I don't know, Shane, and other people may have other insights into metaphors, how they may enrich the books on that introduce systems thinking.
Let me explain a little bit from my cultural background. Chinese society is full of metaphors or damaged by bad metaphors. Actually, they all they had was were metaphors. They had a very hard time to find out non-metaphorical, I mean real word. So metaphors like this unicorn here helps us, I mean, soaked into our childhood. And so we grown up and we started decompose them one after another and realized the Santa Claus is not real. And a lot of things people saying and how do I say that? Oh, okay. A metaphor of the westernization of Chinese society is that they need to invite two gentlemen. One is called the Mr. Science. The other is called the Mr. Democracy to reform that society. So I came from that background. Is kind of I'm sensitive and alert, allergic. What's the word? I'm kind of defensive towards the metaphor, that sort of a metaphor that does more bad things than good things. I give you an example. The current nationalism mobilized by CCP, Communist Party, they said everybody should love their country, and their country equals their government, and the government equals CCP. And the metaphor is a dog would not complain about the family being poor, and the child will not complain about mother being not beautiful. So therefore, you guys should not complain about the CCP government. It's that kind of linkage and relationship that really messed up people's perceptions. So,
If I could build on Jason's concern about what are metaphors and try to tie it to Klaus's concern about, well, we need to be doing the work, the action, and what is work and action if we're not building machines? And then going to Margaret's concern about metaphors. If you could indulge me, I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning and created 2 slides. If I could share these quick 2 slides that may address, does it come up, hopefully?
yes.
Okay, good. Language is neither true nor false. So the ideas of science falsification is not appropriate for what we're trying to do. It provides a way to model things differently. And the presentation last week was Rosen's idea, life is the ability to ask questions. So the organization of language as processes and consequences make cybernetics a science of context. Now, what does that have to do with metaphor? And I was just thinking about that all morning. That's why I created these slides. Language is the art of construction of consequence. So we're not building machines, we're building a critical theory of consequence. It's an ecology of interactions where your destiny and my destiny are connected and how our parts fit into the whole. So what I tried to do is think about virtuous processing of metaphors. What are metaphors? They are dividing lines between gestalts or worlds. And so one of the purposes, I think, of cybernetics is the distinction between virtuous processing of information and metaphors and the vicious processing. And you'll notice that on the right-hand side, Catch-22, Joseph Heller, 1961, where he talked about his experience of World War II, where basically, the power that makes a finger hesitate or obey is more powerful than an armed force. That is the domain we're dealing with. So what I try to do is deal with what are all the catches? And is there a virtuous processing to catch and a vicious processing? And so you can go from the vicious processing all the way down to the double bind form of control without coercion. I mean, Trump is a master of the double bind structure. We can get into that. You know, the Catch 66 in the right-hand side is the secret weapon ability to alter the state of mind of others. But then you go to the left-hand side, it's the developmental side that Jamie has talked about in her presentations before, which is the art of demarcation, distinction, stimulus response of a developmental organism. But they're all within envelopes. And that's what I just want to stop with, is the ability to look at envelopes, and metaphors create envelopes or make them apparent. That's all I wanted to say. There are other slides, but I just wanted to get these 2 points across. Thank you.
Are you the author of all these catches except the 22?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so do you have all of them, or just 8 of them?
I'm sure we could go up to Catch 100, but no. And this would just give us a discipline to say what's on a virtuous processing to build the envelope. The context that I talked about is what cybernetics domain is. And within that context, just like you said, Jason, the ability to provide metaphors is a structuring device. And you can use metaphors of conflict in a double bind situation that Bateson and the family therapy people understand. And that needs to be brought out of family therapy into societal therapy. But that's my bias. So thank you. Sorry.
I would like to say something about Jason's introduction. So I'm always amazed that people want to convince people in Washington or in other capital cities, because we know that political discourse is very different from scientific discourse, and it's not so easy to go from one to the other. And it's a diffusion dynamics. It's not a substantive dynamics. So, and we have other diffusion dynamics. Also, your talk about students is very focused on a kind of explaining diffusion of knowledge. And perhaps it's useful to think about a production dynamics and a diffusion dynamics of science. And then, of course, we come close to the reaction diffusion type of processes, which can bifurcate and which can unify in different stages. So you can have new developments. I thought I wanted to say that in response to what you were saying.
This is Jerry Chandler on my iPhone. Would like to make an interjection here. First of all, I would like to say that I personally think that the use of metaphor is very much accurately described by what Lowell Christie has just outlined. Metaphor is actually as dangerous or as beneficial as the language that is being used, and how the attempt to use this diffusion of knowledge. I think Jason has hit the nail on the head as well with how he views this. The critical point, which I think Richard Knowles brings out, is the practicality of using simple terms, relatively expressed in terms of the wants and needs of the recipient of the knowledge, in order to bring communication about. That does not depend necessarily on metaphor, but perhaps more closely related to analogies either from biology or from mechanics or from astronomy, where the factual content is well articulated and that the necessary distinctions can be made. Metaphors are, in my experience, and here I come from the perspective of molecular biology. When I hear statements that, for example, I'm going to pick on George here, that there's no information in DNA, I find this to be a dangerous concept because it is focused on using the metaphor of genetics with regard to human behavior. And this is not the way genetic systems work. So one is then using the substitute of initials, DNA, which have a totally different meaning in one language as they do in another language. So do you want to use DNA, the concept of DNA, as a part of a vicious circle or as part of a virtuous circle? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jerry, I have, let me follow one question. Do you see a distinction between the biological DNA versus the cultural DNA? I mean DNA. I mean cultural behavior coding is also is related with what you're talking about here, the metaphor.
Well, I personally, I don't see any distinctive notion that relates if you would, the mathematics and the science and the chemistry of DNA to the notions of transformation or communication, the way Lut uses the terms, in human communication. The determinism that is an essential to the individual DNA of each organism is a local and a virtuous process within that context. The communication is all within the cell or among cells. This is not a global conceptual activity, it's a local electrical activity. So in answer to your question, I think that's a very weak metaphor.
All right, if I may, I will prepare a presentation for some future point, like how I think metaphors work. So every metaphor has a benefit and a cost. So there is something good and bad about it. And so it's not that there is one that is better than everything else, because it's a communication mechanism. And so it depends on the interlocutors, how they work with that metaphor. Okay, so maybe I should restate. So first, it's a communication vehicle. It's not about how we think, it's about how we communicate. That's where they're important. And then while we're communicating, there is something good and something bad about it. And it depends on the context. Like you gave the example of the negative consequences. And then the way to handle that is that we always need to, if we want to be good scientists, we need to use 2 or 3 metaphors to say this is what we're trying to say. And according to this metaphor, that's what it is. And according to this, that's what it is. And according to this, that is what it is. And in the management community, this has already been explored and understood, especially the limitations of seemingly attractive metaphors. And the method that I'm describing is similar to the one of triangulation, so that you use the 3 different root metaphors to understand a real life problem. And by using 3 different ones, you try to avoid getting stuck in a myopic mindset, or whatever it's called, a tunnel vision. And I leave it there. So yes, so maybe, yeah.
I think one can
I
make
also want to
more
say
argument.
something.
Okay,
Can I
sorry.
say something about metaphors? I have written actually something about that, but to me, language is metaphor. There is a
Yes.
good phrase of Nietzsche: language is an army of metaphors. The problem is we are not aware of most of them. And in fact, Aristotle is one of the big problem who said metaphors are poetic. Science builds everything on definition. It's an illusion. It's a total illusion. Think about cybernetics. I mean, where does the word cybernetics come from? From the steersman on a ship. This has nothing to do with what we are talking about. It's a metaphor. It's a good metaphor. So I think, good or bad, we often we try to get away from that by formal definitions and etc., but we can hardly do it. In fact, I was once talking actually in China, in Taiwan, about metaphors, and there came a scholar from a Chinese scholar, and they said metaphors is ambiguous understanding. And I said, no, it's just the opposite. And then he gave me a book of Chinese characters. Everything is a metaphor.
Everyone's a metaphor.
The problem is that they are not aware of it. Now we are in the Western world, we are so much accustomed to kind of a definitions, building on definitions, dictionary definitions, and so and we are also not aware of it. So I think we have to, I think the idea that metaphors are particularly cybernetics, I think language is metaphor.
Yes.
One cannot make an argument without using a metaphor. So
No.
that's Hess's point, that the philosophy of science should pay much more attention to how metaphorical science is constructed.
Yeah.
Terry Chandler back again. I really as a chemist, a biochemist, who's worked in the health sciences for decades, and I've watched the influence and the development of the language of chemistry and molecular biology and its relationship to anatomy, as well as our mental health issues and the vast range of drugs and other chemical therapies. And most recently, the very, very rapid development of a vaccine for COVID-19. I just put all these pieces together, and I really, in the very depth of my heart, believe that science is not an illusion, that language is not an illusion. There is a reality out there that we ought to face up with and have the courage to recognize beyond the point of metaphors.
Jerry,
Well, I'm not saying that it is an illusion. I'm saying that you cannot make an inference without the metaphor.
Jerry, I think we're saying exactly the same thing. So there is an observable world and we can gesture and do whatever appeal to our senses. But there is also a world we don't see or we can't observe because it's just impossible. Like the future doesn't exist. And then a photon, it interacts with our eye. We never see it. So we use field metaphors, all sorts of orientational metaphors, and we use it to communicate. And we can't communicate about the unobservable without having something that we actually can understand. And how can we? Yeah,
Mark, I'm not at all unfamiliar with the notion of metaphor. I use them routinely. I find them very effective means of communicating when I so desire to use them with people who are at Jason's first level of understanding. So that it's not the issue of metaphor. It's the issue of what Hegel called the law of the mind. Are you going to use the law of the mind over the law of nature? That's the issue I'm addressing. Metaphors are equally useful in both the law of the mind and the law of nature. The question is, which do we prefer to communicate when we're talking about cybernetics?
So if I can jump in for a second, I think it's worth taking a step back. I think we've abstracted ourselves to an interesting point of irresolve here. As far as I can tell, there's three very different epistemologies that are going on here. There's a constructivist type, a constructionist type, and a realist type, right? This debate has been going on for a solid 1,000 years in the heart of philosophy, of what became philosophy of science. I don't know that the kinds of metaphors we're talking about are resolved through as easily resolved through discourse as we hope they are. Although a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, it comes from a simple idea. If you were to put your child in a car, you wouldn't teach them how to drive over a cell phone. You'd need to be in the seat next to them, right? This is a different kind of knowing, an epistemology that requires an embodiment to the information we use in any kind of system. There's an old paper that's called If Materialism is True, Then the United States is Probably Conscious. And it makes the argument that there's an emergence that comes from different parts of a system that can be accessed by metaphor making. And my original, one of my original philosophy professors talked about science as the art of analogy and philosophy as the science of explaining analogy. Whether or not you agree with this, I think, there's a point at which metaphor becomes a tool and a point where it just becomes a hindrance. If we're talking about the kind of education we hope to bring, cybernetics and young system science students into, it takes a different kind of knowing. And I do agree that there's a very big difference between, the kind of Washington knowing that we're talking about and the methodological knowing. Very different situations requiring very different types of understanding.
If I may, I think they're one and the same, and that the problem is that we have an infantile tendency, and that's being discussed in objective relations theory of psychoanalysis, that, and actually Jason pointed it out in his first slide, to think there is good and there is bad. And so tribalism doesn't come from evolution, but it comes from development, from the infantile reaction when we get out of the womb of like, dislike. And so that over the ages, we have these philosophers who start attacking the other discipline, like realism versus constructivism and realism versus postmodernism. I think it is a very sad and tragic discussion, because it are two people or two groups that are saying something important, and instead of listening to each other, they're attacking each other as like, oh, you deny reality. I don't think the constructivists are denying reality. I just think they're pointing out that our knowledge is constructed as artifacts. Our knowledge is not directly beamed from the heavens by God, and here it is, and there is no discussion necessary. No, it's constructed by us. And so therefore, I think the constructivists are trying to create the space to acknowledge that we are the ones constructing the knowledge. So I don't think our epistemologies are necessarily contradicting. I think
Yeah.
it's important to, may I just one thing? We have a tendency, and you see it everywhere in the world today, like the us versus them. And so the them are always wrong and the us are always right. And I think that is what we need to overcome.
Absolutely. I don't. Let me make it clear. I don't think that constructivist epistemology and a realism are mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they benefit from that discourse. I think they make each other quite stronger. My point is that when we begin to talk about metaphors of accessing that information, of actually interacting with that data towards a productive end, it requires a different kind of interaction than simply metaphor making. And for the work that I'm engaged in right now, this is a kind of embodiment, right? You know, I want to sit here and say that I'm a mathematician or a theoretical chemist or a biologist. I'm not. I'm a strategic philosopher. You know, I'm a Zen swordsman, a musician. These are different kinds of embodiments that give me a tool set that allow me to navigate complex and dense information in a way that metaphor making just hasn't been able to. You know, call me jaded or disillusioned with the kind of density of cybernetics metaphors, because I am. I think, and I'm pretty convinced that the way forward, especially in terms of education and solution making for the cybernetics toolkit, is this kind of embodied practice. Whether or not we have agreeing epistemologies or make good metaphors in communication, the way we interact with the information has to be fundamentally different.
Just a small comment. Embodiment is a metaphor. The idea that you put a concept inside a body, it's a metaphor. Without that, you can't even communicate.
So notice that there's something a little more fundamental, I think. Yeah, the concept of embodiment is a metaphor. But, you know, in Zen studying, right, we don't talk in metaphors, right? The fundamental concept is shut up and sit down. If you can sit still for an hour, then you can, you know, come to some higher level of clarity. You don't talk about driving cars in metaphors. You sit behind the wheel and you learn how to drive a car. You don't do mathematics in metaphors. You sit and learn how to write proofs through logical syllogisms and, you know, axiomatic results that bring you from point A to point B. Metaphor making is an absolute use, and we can talk about it from, you know, a reflexive and second order cybernetic perspective. But if we were succeeding at this kind of metaphor making that we're talking about, you know, cybernetics would have been more mainstream science and, you know, kind of been absolved into the institutions that we're talking about, but it hasn't yet. Yeah, I think
the point is that you shouldn't say that we are metaphor making. The whole scientific argument is embedded in metaphors. So if you look at a scientific article, Jerry, take one from chemistry, and you analyze it textually, you will see that it is built from metaphors. We need them to make a convincing argument, as you can make a convincing argument using your metaphors. It's not that we are doing science and then we sometimes need metaphors, which can be wrong or right, and which can be politicized or not politicized. It's inherent to the scientific enterprise. that we use.
But I would like to take issue with your notion here of the nature of chemistry. The nature of chemistry is a sensory nature. Each of the chemical elements is something that we can and have experienced from our experiences, from our senses, and the names of each of the elements comes from the sensory experience of them.
I was talking about the geomagnetic and chemical.
This notion that somehow the numbering system of chemistry is merely an illusion of language is simply not supported by the realistic facts. So
and that's not what I'm saying, Jay.
George wants to say something. George.
Yeah, for me, an interesting meta question is why do metaphors work at all? Why are we able to construct new concepts from comparisons with things that we already know something about? Why do they work at all? My contention is that it's because this thing that I've been calling systemness is a reality. And that all these so-called isomorphic properties and processes and so forth, that's what allows us to transfer a concept that we feel we pretty well understand because we've grasped its systemness to something that we're trying to understand that has certain appearances that would seem to be very similar to the one that we do understand.
It enables us to draw a distinction, to make a distinction.
What goes on mentally in the brain as you construct these new kinds of concepts. I posted a book that's been very helpful to me in thinking about these kinds of things in the chat. Susan Carey is quite well known in psychology in her particular field, cognitive science. So anyway.
Yes, what you say is that we can make a distinction when using metaphors. We need them for making the distinctions, because we cannot come from the not yet metaphorical to the already metaphorical.
I have a question. How many people you think, how much percentage that you think that can be aware of a metaphor instead of just living inside it?
Well, I would say we are aware only of very few.
Very few, because aware of a language, you have to learn foreign language. Yeah. You have to learn a foreign language before you learn.
The problem is you learn how to speak as a child, but you don't know the history of the words, and you do not know the nature of metaphors unless there are certain dominant ones that you become aware of. Like, as I mentioned, the steerman, the fisherman who steers a boat, that is a metaphor for cybernetics, but it goes down in all kinds of things. For example, the whole notion of systems. I mean, that is also a metaphor which deals with things that we know, the connections between people or between things. We are aware only of very few. I think the problem is to become aware maybe more of the kind of things that we are doing. But that is another issue. I'm not so sure if that is entirely limited to cybernetics.
When I first came to this country, when I was young, I got a very big surprise that 90% of Americans, I mean 90% of Americans do not have a passport. So that means they never had any exposure to any other country. Because why do they need to go to another country? This is the best country in the world. So there's, even now, I think the portion of Americans without a passport is still very, very high. So without awareness of any other societies, how can I be aware of their living in a language? And without being aware of the living in a language, English language, and how can they be aware that they are using metaphors? So my question to Jerry, to Jamie, can you imagine a world that is totally metaphor free? I mean, no metaphors, all metaphors are banned. What kind of society that would be?
I only can talk from my personal experience, and in my case, it was Karl Popper, and I was reading his book, and he had a bucket, the bucket theory of the mind. And so I started drawing buckets, but that was actually the container metaphor. And I started everything everywhere. I suddenly started drawing every text I was reading. I was drawing circles and saying, is it in or out of the circle? So the three worlds became for me three containers. And then I start looking at the university and I say, are they studying this container, or the interaction? So I did that, and I wrote an entire paper on it, and I published it. And I used the word metaphor, and I never paid attention to it. And then one day I said, let me look it up in the library system of the University of Purdue University. That's where I was. And then it was like Sesame, like Alibaba and the 40 robbers. Like you have the secret password, and suddenly you enter the cave full with the riches. So I was overwhelmed, like thousands of books on metaphors, and it never occurred to me to look for it until I was like 37-year-old. And no one, I mean, I may have heard about it, but it never was one ear in, the other ear out. And so it illustrates how language works and what university professors are supposed to be doing. They're creating vocabularies with proper distinctions so that people in the street can learn them and more easily communicate with one another. But it also emphasizes that we don't need the professors, because we can just have a community among itself that say, okay, we'll use these distinctions. And they exactly work with metaphors, but they just call it something else, like an analogy or an image, or I don't know what. But what I'm trying to say is I believe with Klaus, and not because I was, I discovered the argument by making the error, so to say, of ignoring metaphors. But I do believe with Klaus, the moment we are born and the moment we start babbling, and actually the moment we're born, we use the container metaphor, like we leave a container and then we start working with it. And then the next one is the yardstick, when we look at our caregivers. And now we start splitting in containers, and now we have to so we have like many containers, and now we need to decide how to organize the containers. So we put them on top of each other, or we put them inside each other, or we have the binary. But then we have also the opportunity to put our containers in a circle. And I think that is the adult form of reasoning, and that's evidence of adulthood, the ability to understand the value of the circle. And very interesting, all over the world, there are cultures where this importance of meeting in a circle is recognized as being crucial. But what is important in each of these cultures is a ritual that you enter the circle, so that people can leave all their yardsticks and binaries and judgmental thinking behind, and then become a member of the circle. So I think I use the word metaphor because there is a literature of 2,500 years, but I could have I could use another word if I had grown up in another culture, and I probably will be using another word in another culture. I will probably say, I'm telling a story.
Just a comment on Alex. Actually, he mentioned science. Oh no, mathematics. Now, if you are a mathematician and you only do the symbols and you have a logic and so, that's not metaphorical. But as soon as you relate it to something else, that language enters. So I think that should make a distinction. For example, a machine doesn't work on metaphors. Machine is working the way it is because it's constructed that way. But it doesn't mean that we all need to be machines as a scientist in order then to avoid the human part of it. That means we should be part of it.
Absolutely, I don't disagree. I'm not convinced that the metaphor making and that process of reconceptualizing metaphors comes first, because when you learn mathematics, right, you have to learn the actual mathematics before you can use it to make metaphors, before you can read mathematics and understand what the metaphors it makes. And if we're talking about learning cybernetics and where it applies, the act of metaphor making shouldn't come first. It should be assimilated at the end. It should become the last step. Differential geometry wasn't used in general relativity, right? Until the science of differential geometry was fleshed out enough to be used as a metaphor for space-time, and so on. There is this, my point is just kind of, I think, pretty basic and fundamental. Is that if we're looking to talk about teaching cybernetics and the act of using cybernetics as a cognitive tool set for solution making, right, then it requires us to talk about something very different and more tangible and accessible than metaphor making.
Well,
if I'm sorry, apologies, Shane, you go first.
No. Well, I wanted just to say in connection with that, maybe we should make a catalog or start at listing the metaphors that drive cybernetics. Circularity, it's a metaphor. And all of these things, maybe that is what we should think of and then build cybernetics from that.
So, if I may just, as a follow-up to Alexei. So, Alex, you have not paid attention to how you learned mathematics, and you definitely have not looked at the history of mathematics, because it's full of metaphors. The very first, go back to the Greeks and look at categorical logic and the relation between logic and mathematics. And the conversation is full of metaphors that are being used to understand what's going on. And we could maybe organize a presentation in the future to further explore this.
I wanted to react to Jerry.
Inject here that the logic of mathematics, if you are familiar at all with this historical development, was changed dramatically with the work of Tarski and Lesniewski. Tarski, the basis of Tarskian logic is that you need a second language to explain the first language. Correspondingly, you need a third language to explain the second language. And you have then a hierarchy of language usage. And these languages obviously have different logical terms in them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a different language. So with all due respect, I think the notion of metaphor is fully compatible with different meta languages. It's just that how you choose to use these metaphors, either in a logical sense or in some purely emotional sense. And steering the systems requires that you, if you're going to steer them scientifically, it requires that you are aware of the power of your metaphors. And this is quite consistent with Lowell's notion of vicious circles versus virtuous circles.
If I could just add something.
No, I wanted very much to Jerry, and then I'll give it to you. It is not only the case that it is meta a metaphor. It's if you look into its scientific article, I'm aware that it's different from a lab practice, but if you look into a scientific article, even if it is chemistry, and you go very precisely into it, you will see that the inference is made using a metaphor, because we need the metaphor to make the distinction of the new knowledge claim.
If I could just see a connection between what Alex, Margaret, and Klaus has been talking about, because there's a really important phrase that all three of you have used, which is an orientating metaphor. If cybernetics is about steering, helmsman, etc., we're looking at it as a noun. What metaphors do is steer us. So what we're looking for is that steering mechanism. We are all prisoners in certain cars. The question is, what kind of car do we want to be steered by? And so it's not the fact that we have this concept of steerage, but taking it upon ourselves reflexively of what's steering me and my perceptual field, my conceptual field, and the logic that I am within that paradigm and within that logic. That then allows us to go to an action-oriented concern that Alex has. How do you embody this? How do you get that into a system? Because I want to know what I'm being steered by. We are prisoners in our cars.
Yeah.
What car do we want to be steered by?
By the literature.
I've just posted a quotation from C.S. Peirce from his article, How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And as you know, he created what he called pragmatism. And he says, if you'd like to read it, the final says, there is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. In other words, any of our ideas, however we express them, can lead to some difference of practice. So the emphasis that Alex has been putting on action, there being an action, is part of it. And I've expressed this elsewhere. Worked with Pascal conversation theory. We developed a concept of understanding, which was whatever you say conceptually has to be externalized as something non-symbolic, as a model, something touchable, something manipulable. And this is the heart of science, that there is something external to the discourse that we can talk about, look at, touch. Okay.
I think what Rosen and Judith Rosen were talking about is, instead of just looking at something tangible to touch, to embody, what Rosen talked about is there is an objective boundary made of metaphors, whatever we're talking about being constructed, we're being constructed. And that is an object of discernment that we as cyberneticians should be thinking about. Mm-hmm. So the boundary that forms me, the internal logic algorithm of that car that's driving me and showing me this panorama around me, I had better understand, unless I just want to be a passenger.
Can I, if it is not only you, it's the whole science which is doing that in their literature. So you can find those distinctions and make it more an objective science itself, which is not only how do I construct, but how is it constructed?
So I think this is the point that I think this is a great point. What I'm trying to do is make a transition here. You know, it's I think we're talking a lot about a discourse of discourses, right? And I think we agree that information and the way it is understood is discursive. What I'm saying is that there's a transition to be made in this research practice if it is to be action-oriented and tangible, and that is this reflexivity of the research narrative, right? And that's this kind of embodied discourse where I can situate my internal discourse with the rest of the discourses going on and take that as its most tangible and fundamental basic. And I think that that is something more fundamentally embodied than the kind of analogy and meaning making that comes later from a lot of larger discourses. It does take a step back and saying this is kind of analogy I'm making and understanding through metaphor, but this transition from a meta discourse to a reflexive definition, of how discursive information is gathered in the research process is something totally different, I think.
Well, we're past our time already, guys.
Okay.
Our European friends needs to go to dinner, and our East Coast friends needs to go to lunch.
Okay.
Well,
Great
looks like
discussion.
we will continue this. Who will be doing some follow-up after today's topic? But next week we will have Lut and Jamie and Edmund, who is not here today, to talk about the Luhmann's ideas. And
if I could, before we head out, a lot of you know that I'm doing some pretty intensive startup work right now with a small research institute looking to focus on narrative-based action research in systems resilience. There's a lot of learning I have yet to do about cybernetic method and about where this goes. And I think it's just a rip-roaring shame if I don't make use of the vast amount of knowledge and experience just sitting in this room alone. So I'm gonna drop my email here. I have emails for some of you, and some of you I've already connected with. But I would like to, at least go around and have a very strong set of conversations with people who can do some good advising and guiding for the work I'm doing right now.
cool. Also, we had a chat box full of your comments and talks there. If you just can, there's a button somewhere that you can save the chat for your further reference. If not, I'm going to, I can forward that to you. And I thank you very much for coming for this unfinished work. We probably will continue to do this more.